Welcome to part 2 of the Evil Jester video. If you haven't already, make sure you check out part 1. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start detailing. So in part 1 we completed the white underpainting. Now we are switching to a thinned out black mix, which is basically made up of transparent base, which you mix with your reducer, so however thin you need it. So any water-based transparent base will work. And then I've added drops of black to that, and what that gives me is an extremely transparent black, almost like a black ink, and it's just perfect because it's not that dark, so you can start to bring out all the shading without sort of overdoing it and making the areas way too dark if you're just using black alone. So we'll get to using black at the end when we do the final detailing, but at the moment I want to shape this artwork a little bit more after completing the white, so we're going to use the mix that I just showed you. So like I said, mix it up with transparent base and reducer to your liking, to your however thin you usually run your paint, and then add the drops of black. So you can see I started and I thought it's a bit too light, so I've added a little bit more black so it's a bit more obvious and gives me a bit more shape a lot quicker, rather than having to build it up with numerous tones. So you be the judge of how dark you want it. It's totally up to you. Alright, and then what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start really texturing, deepening all the shadows and bringing out all the artwork. So starting to really create that 3D element to the artwork. So if you remember from the last video, we established our light source to be the top sort of right. So you can see on the eye there, just on that specular highlight on the iris, that it's coming from that direction, so the top right, meaning that everything bottom left would be in shadow. So if you can imagine his nose of the Jester is obviously a sphere, like the clown nose, you would shade on that bottom section there, which is what I'm doing. As I'm shading, I'm building up the texture as well, so I'm not just doing a flat shadow. You'll probably remember from the last part that we were building textures using the white. So this is the same sort of thing. As you go on with your artwork, you want to add more and more texture. You don't want things to look flat. And also another little tip is to treat every section like as one separate piece. So I'm focusing on this nose at the moment, so I'm just focusing on that, nothing else. And I'm building the shadow in that. I'm remembering where my light source is and I'm darkening the areas, and then I'm building in the texture. Okay, so that's really important. Try and isolate your artwork. With complex sort of portraits, what I get a lot of my students to do is I'll get them to actually cut out a square in a bit of paper and then just put that over the section of, say, the eye or the nose or the mouth area, so that it blocks out the rest of the artwork and they can only see that section. That gets them to focus on that piece. Alright, so it's a really handy tip. So you can see I'm adding some texture to the nose here, and what I'm using is an eraser pencil. It's not just a white pencil. A lot of people, when they see me using this at a show, they think I'm using a white pencil to do the highlights, and I often hear them going, oh, that's cheating. But no, this is an eraser pencil. Okay, the idea of this is that it removes layers of the paint. So with the water-based paint, if you attack it with one of these prior to it drying really fast, every brand will be a little bit different, but what will happen is you can actually remove a bit of the paint, so that slight overspray, and it'll give you a natural highlight. Alright, so the eraser pencil that I'm using is the Faber-Castell 7057 is the code. Alright, and you'll notice that as we go through the video, I use this pencil quite a bit, and one end is a white end and the other end is a pink end. Now the white end is a hard eraser, so that's a bit more aggressive, whereas the pink end is softer. Alright, so you can use that for just doing real subtle highlights. So they are really handy, and everything with these sort of eraser pencils was taught to me by a good friend of ours, Drew Blair. So he uses them in all his paintings to create that photorealistic appearance. So I've basically just merged that into my style of painting, and I use it to create my textures and bits and pieces. And I'll even use it when I'm doing a portrait or something. Alright, so they're really handy, really good to use. See if your local art shop stocks them. They are a little bit difficult to find. If you can't get them from your local art shop, then jump online. Hopefully by searching for that code you should be able to find something that's similar or equivalent, or even you'll get exactly the same thing. Alright, and you just sharpen them with a normal X-Acto blade. Alright. Okay, getting back to the airbrushing, so we're still using the same mix, so we're going to use that pretty much the whole way through this video. So like I said to you, this video is all about establishing more texture, deeper tones and sharper detail. So you can see I've just switched back to that Faber-Castell eraser pencil, and I'm using the harder end there just to erase some of the bits out. So you can see how quickly I jumped onto that after just spraying it, just straight on there, getting a bit of the eraser dust off with my finger, and then back into the airbrushing. Alright, so now we're working on the eye, zoomed in on that so you can see that a bit clearer. So you can see I'm up pretty close there, using a CMC Plus micron, and nice and close just to get that nice sharp detail. Now I'm putting in some imperfections in the eye. So again, just really tiny little dagger strokes. You can also use texture templates to achieve this, or you could also use the eraser pencil, so that works well as well. Alright, so just above the brow there, working in some detail too. So it looks like his skin's a bit cracked and aged. So just working that airbrush left and right to create that defined edge. If you're not comfortable with doing this freehand, you can always make yourself some paper templates just to get that sharp edge. You could also refer back to your eraser pencil, spray the edge and then remove a bit of that overspray to clean it up a little bit. Alright, so just shading that out now, blending that, so coming back a bit further just to give that dusting. We're not too worried about the highlight disappearing a little bit. As long as we can still see it, we can re-establish that later. So at the moment it's really all about shaping and adding those details. So nice and neat under the eye to create that eyeball. And we're going to run a bit more of a shadow. So I'm just sketching with that airbrush. You can see I'm pulling the airbrush out of the shot a bit, that's to remove the tip drying. Now working on that brow, so just shading that to give it a 3D element. You can see I leave a little bit of a gap there just to pick up on that highlight, something that I've sort of picked up over the years. So, and now we're just doing the straps from the clown nose. So you can just see there, just establishing more shading. The shading will just shape it, alright? So keep that in mind. Anything that you shade is going to put that into darkness, but also make it curve if it needs to be, or you can knock things back and leave highlighted areas to pop them out. So you can sort of push and lift sections of your artwork. Alright. So you can see the video sped up a little bit here as we go on, like I've mentioned to you in part 1. Because it's such a long video set, so there's 3 parts to this video, but a lot of them are well over an hour long. I thought I'd speed up certain sections, but also have some parts in real time so that you can see one area being completed, and then we kind of move on and speed it up just so that it doesn't drag on too much and you get bored. So hopefully it's still got enough there for you to see what we're doing and how it's done. Alright, so just taking my time to detail, add more texture. So you can spend hours and hours texturing because you can virtually spray it on, remove it, spray it on, remove it. So we're also going to come in with white highlights a bit later on. So, you know, there's numerous different things that you can do to create texture and to build your highlights and your shadows. We're just bringing all that together. Get onto the hat. Starting to put those creases in. So you can see from doing all that white underpainting, we've got a nice little roadmap virtually of where we need to go with things. And you can always come back in and just dust over the top with a bit of white before you do this step if you're not happy with how bright it is, or if it's not bright enough for whatever reason. So I'm just working on that stitching now. So you've got to be up really close for that. Again, we drew this artwork, so we don't have a exact perfect reference. It's all worked out off a sketch, so I'm just sort of making it up as I go, treating every object separately and just working with my light source. So if you're not confident with that and you're still new to airbrushing, it might pay to get a reference, find something that's nice and clear, and then work off that, because at least you've got all your detail and your light source and everything's there for you, so you can virtually just copy it, so that way you can practice your airbrushing. Because there's a lot of sections to this where you need to be reasonably good with an airbrush just to get that real fine detail. I've just taken my time there to render each stitch. You can see I'm just spraying out those edges now, just to make it look like that stitch is deeper, like really stitched into the fabric of the hat. So again, you can get a reference for each stitch if you like, and virtually replicate that. Now I'm going to do the center seam. So up nice and close. You can see even though it's a line, I'm going up and down and I'm kind of sketching with it. That's just the way I airbrush. So it might not suit everyone. Some people might prefer to just hit it all in one shot. So just use whatever method you're comfortable with and whatever's going to give you the best result. So still working on that center stitch there. And start rendering that skull on the top of the jester's hat. Do the eye socket. So just sketching the outline and then filling it in. You'll notice on some of the up close shots that they're not just completely solid, the sockets, so I tend to leave a bit of a highlight just to shape them a little bit more. So now we're going to start to add a bit more texture into the hat itself. Another crease there with shading, so we know that that's the area that will be in shadow, so we're darkening that off a little bit. Even so, I'm not just blasting the paint on, I'm building it up. You can see I'm gradually going darker, and that's the beauty of using these transparent bases mixed with black. What that allows you to do is that you can just keep coating it, and however dark you've mixed it, it won't go darker than that particular mix, so you've got a lot more control. Alright, so it's a little bit like when they tattoo with just the black inks. So they make up different strengths of the black. It's the same sort of principle. You'll just shade and deepen your shadows with it. So exactly the same idea. So we're just bringing those shadows in and then blending out. So I'm up close on that edge and then feathering out towards the center, so that gives me the illusion of a 3D object. So it's providing that circular shape. Now again, I'm not too concerned about a little bit of overspray, because we're going to put a bit of a background in later on. So we're going to mask the actual artwork off as a positive to get that background sprayed in. Alright. So doing the eyebrow areas now, the skull, doing the little, making him look a bit mean. Shadows under the jaw there. You can see his teeth aren't really there. It's this kind of bit of a stretchy skinned skull. And his teeth are kind of morphing into the jester's hat. Again, you can change this, you can do whatever you like. You can also just run with the normal bells and get rid of the skulls. It's whatever you're into. So sorry, that's a little bit out of shot at the moment, but you get the idea. Just keep shading. And there we go. Give you a bit of a close-up. You can see now, so to do that sort of stretchy skin, kind of just build up a bit of a dot and then feather it down. Alright. He's pretty well established. Now just coming in with the soft part of the eraser pencil, and you can see it's slightly giving it a bit more of a highlight, and I'm just putting a bit of texture in there as well. Now that's dried a bit too much, so I'm switching to the harsher side, more aggressive part of the eraser, which is the white tip. Wiping that off, and now we're ready for the next part. We're just going to shade in over the top of what we've just, some of the highlights we just created and those little subtle textures. So even though it doesn't look like much, it still makes a big difference in your artwork. Try not to just paint things really flat, or I've seen it a lot where people use the freehand templates and they virtually just spray it solid to establish all your outlines, and then they'll just do a couple of little shadows and they think that's done, and it looks way too stenciled. So you can kind of utilize a template, but then add your freehand element to it. That's sort of what they're designed for. Alright, so we're going on to the other part of the hat here. Sped it up a little bit, as you've seen before how to do the stitches. So we're just going to move along a little bit. So just do your seam down the center like we did earlier. And there'd be a bit of shadow coming off that other part of the hat there. We're going to add the stretchy parts to this skull. So it looks like the skin's part of the fabric, that they're coming out of the tips of the jester's hat. Shading the socket. Going in, adding a bit of a couple of creases. That's also giving us the shape. A drop shadow from that previous one that we did. So again, with the drop shadows, don't just go solid with them. You can see it's sort of a mid-tone there, and I've got a reasonably sharp sort of shadow line on there. So that's, depending on how close it is to your object, that's how sharp your line should be. So obviously if it's extremely far away, if it's say a I don't know, like a plane flying over a bit of land, then that's going to be a lot higher up, so you're going to get a softer shadow. So whenever something's really close to something, the shadow will be sharper, so just keep that in mind. I'm just going to add this checkered pattern now. So you can see how easy that was, just sort of run those two lines in, and now I'm just colouring in off my pattern. It doesn't have to be extremely sharp and perfect because we want this to look like actual material. And he's an evil jester, so he's not going to have completely clean hat or clothes. So we want it a bit grubby looking, which is fine. So we're just deepening those shadows. You can see I'm working back over a section, doing another drop shadow onto the hat there, onto that material, establishing my pattern again. So just take your time, up reasonably close. Just blending those down, filling in all those squares. You can see that's coming together. So you can see how much this tone actually brings everything out. So you could do a lighter one before this, but totally up to you. Depends how comfortable you are with using something that's a little bit darker. Now we're just doing a bit of a shadow in there as well, just to crease up that material. And jumping back onto that skull, establishing the nostril there. Got a bit of tip drawing, pick that off and back into it. Right, doing the other eye socket. Blending out and running some of those teeth in. So it's pretty small, this artwork, so you can see how tiny it is, so you've got to be up reasonably close. So if you want to practice and you're not as advanced with the airbrush, it might pay to do it a little bit larger. Might make life a bit easier for you just to get in all the details. So shading, pulling out that eyebrow there, and just fogging in on the skull there just to create uneven textures, so it always looks good. You don't want him looking too smooth. And I've got that air pressure right down, and I'm just pulling back on the trigger finger. You can probably just see my fingers going back and forth, back and forth. Alright, you'll notice I'm wearing my glove again, so I'm up nice and close if I need to rest on the artwork, because we're going to clear coat this. We want that to be a nice clean surface. So if I'm ever doing anything automotive, you'll notice that I'm always wearing a glove on that left hand because I'm right-handed. So now I'm getting my eraser pencil again with the aggressive end, and I'm just pulling a bit of that texture back in just to break it up a little bit and remove the smoothness of the airbrush. Sometimes the airbrush, because it paints so flawlessly, it can make things look a bit fake because of that. So by using a razor pencil, you bring in natural textures, and yeah, it just makes things look a lot better, even with something that is a fantasy artwork like what we're doing here, but especially in portrait painting and things like that, it definitely makes a huge difference. Alright, so we're doing the other stitching now. You can see that skull's facing away, so he hasn't got as much detail to put in. Bringing out the shadows, back of his head there, and the back of his jaw. So we're obviously not going to see any teeth on this part. Nor are we going to see his eye sockets or his nostril. So be careful of that. If you ever got a skull facing away, make sure that you pay attention to what you're painting. We're just shading that. We've got another drop shadow from that main part of the hat there. Working back on the other skull. Now we're going to do the other one that's facing away. Same procedure, stitching again. So if you want to see how that's done properly, just refer back to the first part of the hat that we did, which is a slower filmed section. These bits have all been sped up. So just rendering that skull again, doing the center seam. Not as much detail on this one, but you get the idea. Now we'll do the last part of the hat. Again, just sketching with that airbrush, building up my tones, keeping that air on all the time and just pulling that trigger finger back and forth, back and forth. So paint on, paint off, paint on, paint off. You'll notice on the back of my CMC Plus there, on the newer model microns, you can actually remove the air cap, which you can do that anyway with all the water airbrushes, and they spray really nice and fine, but you probably saw it better in the shot previously, but you'll see the cap is actually screwed onto the back of the airbrush handle there, so that's a neat little feature so you don't lose your little, there you go, you can see it there, so you can see it sticking up on the back of the handle there. So a lot of people don't realise that. I've mentioned it to a few students and they've got that particular airbrush and they've never realised that you can do that. So Hopefully that's helped out a few people. So a bit more detail here, a bit more shading, building up the last of the Jester's hat. So up close on the edge again. And then now we're doing the skull. Going back, shading, darkening it off, especially where it meets the other part. So we want to go a bit darker in there. Doing the checkers as well on the hat, on the base of the hat, on that bit of material. Doing the stretchy part of the skin on the skull, deepening some of those shadows where the stitching is to make it look like it's almost stitched so tight that it's putting little holes in there. And now we're going to start working on the glove. So up nice and close to establish the thumb and the fingers. Again, just sketching with that airbrush. Just taking my time. You can see picking off the tip drawing again. That's why I've disappeared out of the shot. Alright, so coming back in now. And shading that hand. So I'm making sure I'm putting all the creases in on the fingers and the glove and the thumb. Blocking the camera view a little bit there, but we'll fix that up in a minute. Okay, so leaving that glove for a little bit, jumped onto this part. As I mentioned in the other part, you'll notice that I do this quite a bit. I tend to jump around and paint different sections of the artwork. Allows it to stay a bit more interesting too if you get bored with a section, or if you find that one of the areas that you're working on isn't sort of going to plan, then I tend to move to another part of the artwork, work on that, and then I'll come back to the area that I was working on previously. That way, hopefully, to avoid any mistakes. Remember, it's just paint, you can always fix it. Well, mostly always. Working away on the teeth. Just building that whole mouth area up with bits of skin. Working on the lips. The grooves in the middle of the teeth. And just putting some uneven parts to the teeth too, so they don't look too perfect. And now I'm going to come in and add some shadow to the bottom of that lip, and also add some of the grooves. So little dagger strokes to add the grooves. Another shadow there to shape it. So take your time. Doing the top gum, bringing all that out. Adding the stretchy bits of skin. The shadow from underneath that nose. Keep building it up. You can see I'm just pulling sections out as far as adding more shading, just to lift certain areas and to detail them more with more texture. So just establishing more and more uneven textures. So we don't want it all smooth. Making it look like his face is nicely weathered. So spend the time to do this, just to really build on the areas so that they don't appear flat. Alright, back to the grooves on that lower lip, and a drop shadow underneath as well, and then just adding a bit of shading to the chin area there. Again, just taking my time. So you'll note my airbrush is moving in and out all the time, but reasonably close for working in all of these details, especially in the areas with the teeth. So you've got to be up nice and close to get those defined lines or those sharp shadows in between each tooth. So now we're going to work on the skeleton here, and also the ruffles on the shirt. So similar to what we did before, but we're just going to darken and start detailing all those areas. On the ruffles, you're going to establish the separate sections of each ruffle, and then we're going to use our airbrush to create some of those dagger strokes to give it the shape. So just jumping back now to the face there, sort of moving around quite a bit. So apologies for that. So we're starting to bring in some of those dagger strokes. You can see that already gives it that curve. So you can see every time I move it, my trigger finger goes back. So that way I'm getting that nice tapered dagger stroke. Remember, I do have a video on how to do dagger strokes, so if you're a bit unsure, make sure you check out that one. So just starting to build my textures. We are going to go white highlights on top of this as well, so that's going to add to it. I tend to always work in a lot of the dark areas first, so that way you can gauge all your shadows from your artwork, but also if you've gone too dark, you're in a dark area, whereas if you start in the lighter bits and you go too dark, well then you've got to try and fix those, so then you can almost start off your artwork on the wrong foot and you've got a lot of work to fix it to get back to where you were previously. So if you just start off in the dark areas first, like with skulls in the eye sockets, the nostril, then underneath the jaw line, because there's usually a heavy shadow there, and then you work into your lighter areas, then you pretty much cover yourself. So just building up those ruffles, working each one individually. You can see we're sped up again now. So just take your time, build it up, don't try and rush it. If you want to add lots of texture and detail into artwork, there is really no way you can do it super quick. To add all that into your artwork and to make it look a bit better than just a shaded flat sort of painting, you need to add the textures, and texturing can take lots of time. Alright, so just don't rush it. It'll be worth it in the end. A lot of the time too, those subtle textures will show through all your tones, especially if you're doing coloured artworks and if you're using candy colours, which are completely transparent automotive pigments. They give you the luxury of spraying over the top of something, even something like this, in its state as it is now, and then you'll still see all the detail underneath, but you'll have like a bit of a tint over the artwork. So very similar to the other video that we've got, which is the skull with orange candy. So check that one out. That kind of shows you how candy looks over artwork. Alright, so just still detailing those ruffles. We're doing the drop shadows underneath so they look like 3D objects, not just flat. Just building. Like I said, takes time. Can be a little bit monotonous on video, but a lot of people have kept saying they want more of the longer videos, and not to speed it up too much. So we've only sort of, wherever it's sped up in this video, it's only twice the speed. So hopefully, even though we're showing you a lot of sections that are sped up and then we've still got some that are real time, it'll at least be educational enough so that you'll learn a lot off it. But by doing that, it means we're going to have longer videos. But the response we're getting seems to be pretty good, so we'll keep doing them. Alright, so dividing that up, you can see there, just put in those dagger strokes on that one there, and kind of working my way out, so splitting each section and then blending up from a spot. So just keep establishing all your shadows, keep working them in, and as you're going along, you sharpen as well. So, and remember, black's kind of like your eraser in sections, so you can, like I did just then, I didn't like one of the bits because it wouldn't have shown up, so I just eliminated it. And if you do make a mistake or you paint something out that's not right, you can always go white back over the top and bring it back into the artwork. Alright, so we're moving back onto that glove now, up a bit closer to show you, which is good. You get a gist of how the fingers are getting rendered. So we don't want this to look like a fleshy hand, this should look like a glove. Alright. So just shading each individual crease in his fingers there. You can see how close I am. Remember, this is a slight angle with the camera, so it'll make the airbrush look like it's a little bit further away than what it actually is. But we are reasonably close. So just keep shading, keep blending. We're going to bring our highlights in later anyway, so if you go too dark in one spot, even though it's better not to, but we can always pull that out again. So just putting some creases in that glove and then blending, so I'm further away just to dust out from each crease that I'm doing. Doing the bottom part of the glove, adding a few creases in there too. So just blending my shadows and building them up. Again, don't saturate your artwork. And then up close to get those real defined edges and those sharper shadows. Now we're going to go nice and close just to pull out that arm there. So you can see how much sort of a 3D element you can get by just using one, well, pretty much the white and then a black, you know, so even though the black's going to be different strengths, so we've got one more after this that we're going to use to deepen the shading, but really it's just using white and black and transparent base. They're the only colors we're using, and you can really get a nice 3D element to your artwork. So we're just doing that trim on the glove there and adding in the checkers, that pattern underneath, which is similar to what we did on the hat. So we're just consistently running that theme. We just thought it'd look a bit nicer than having it plain. But you can see I'm not even really following what I had because it wasn't really accurate. So that's the beauty of this, you can just re-establish it with the black. So don't just repaint any mistakes or anything that is incorrect from your previous tone. The idea is as you go darker, you need to fix certain areas, and no doubt you'll probably have areas that you've drawn in incorrectly or you've left a section out, well, when you go darker, that's the time that you can repair those sections. So you pretty much want to have that done by tone number 2, so that when you come in with your final tone, you can then follow those shadows. So you can kind of see now where it's at so far. You can see a slight brownish tinge as well to the artwork. A lot of the blacks will give you that, but we're not too worried about that. Once it gets clear coated, it's going to change that whole look again. It'll bring all those colors and make them a lot darker. As far as colors, I mean just the blacks will be darker, and that brownish tone will kind of disappear. You can also use it to your advantage, and that's why I'm not too worried about it with this artwork, because it is meant to be a sort of evil, tattered looking jester, and we don't want him looking perfectly clean, so a little bit of brownish tinge off the black isn't really going to hurt. If anything, it will just add to it a little bit. So we're just doing the pins off that voodoo doll. So just up close to pull out our sharp detail, and I'm shading them as I go, but I'm leaving a bit of a highlighted edge, and also just that edge so that it appears like a 3D pinhead rather than just a flat circle. So up close to do the teeth, you can see they're pretty tiny. Just building my shading and fixing up the shapes of the skull as I go. You can see that was sort of, the top of his head had a bit of a bump in it. Looked like he hit his head, so we fixed that for him. Just a bit of a shadow now onto the cranium there from the pin, because they are sticking up, they're going to cast a shadow on his head. Just doing the rib cage. So just working that rib cage in. Darkening off as well while we go. Adding the splits in the bone. Coming in now and rendering the clenched fist, so the glove there from the jester. So just defining the thumb there and that finger. Again, not just keeping it smooth, it's a glove, so make it look a bit rough. So if you watch, you can really see my trigger finger going back and forth there. So remember, air on all the time. A lot of people don't do that. They use the airbrush almost like a spray can. The problem is, if you do go on off with your air, you are going to create more tip drying within the airbrush. So it's important to treat it as a double action airbrush should be treated, which is air on all the time. Press right down on that trigger finger, don't let go of it, and then pull back as you move to do all your fine detail. Alright? So bringing in a bit more shading, pulling out the area there, the other fingers of that clenched fist. Just working on the hand there of the skeleton, bringing out all the little fingers and the joins. Because this is so small, you can try and add in every single detail, but even if you just suggest certain details, your eye will complete the rest of the artwork, believe it or not. So Sometimes you don't need to paint every single thing in. If you focus on the main areas of something, then, like I said, your eye will finish the design for you. Alright, so glove and that checkered pattern again. So yes, it's a little bit more work to put the checkered pattern in, but it just adds a bit more detail and a bit more interest to the painting rather than just a flat colour. So little things like that are good to include in your art. Try to think outside the square and just try something different, you know. Little things like that can be challenging, and that's going to get you to the next level. So don't be scared if it's something that you haven't attempted or you haven't done. You don't want to get in the habit of just painting everything that's, you know, easy for you, because you're never going to progress. Alright, so still working on the skeleton there, doing those bones. The shadows as well. A couple of dagger stroke shadows coming down the legs of the skeleton there, and then we're just doing his feet. So establishing all the bones there. You can see the ankle bone, little knee there. So again, you can see how tiny. You look at the front of my airbrush. He's pretty small, but it's good fun. Now we're working on the spring from the Jack in the Box, or should I say Jester in the Box. So just detailing that. You can see how carefully I'm painting that in. Again, drawing or sketching with my airbrush. I'll go over a line two or three times. You know, I'm not afraid to do that. It'll build it up nice and smooth, rather than just trying to, you know, run thicker paint and hitting it in one spot, or even trying to run thicker paint so that you get really quick coverage. I would much prefer to have thinner paint and you get a nice smooth finish, plus you get less tip drying. So we're just adding a bit of a shadow as well where that spring lays over the top of the previous one, and we'll be doing the same with the coils. So take your time, keep rendering. The highlights on this will really pop it out, because highlights on a real bright white highlight on a metal surface looks really, it makes it really appear like metal. So you don't need a great deal of extra detail. You can almost do a lot with that, just that white. So just continuing the spring there. You can see another little shadow. Make sure you kind of keep the thickness consistent too. So you can see I kind of eliminate certain areas because these are quite oversprayed, so I'm sharpening them up, but I'm also then adjusting the size of them. We've got the luxury to do that because this is a black panel. So obviously if this was a white background, you wouldn't be able to do this, so you'd have to be a little bit more accurate with your initial drawing. That's why I do like working on black. I think it just seems to be a lot more forgiving, and the artwork looks really nice on a black background. So again, just rendering those springs. So as we get lower to the bottom there of the box, there's going to be a lot more shading down there to create that depth. So we're just adding some shadows from the ruffles onto the spring, just where it overhangs, and now we're going to finish off that spring at the base there. So we're just shaping that. Now we're going to darken some of these shadows. So you can see there I just drew in the back of one of the springs there. So it's kind of a little bit uneven as it springs out. There's nothing wrong with that. Now we're going to start on the box. So again, if you're not comfortable freehand, you can mask some of these areas up. If you are going to mask over the top of this and you've been using water-based paint, even though most water-based paint sticks perfectly, I always recommend putting an Intercoat clear over the top just to seal it in. So I will be doing the same thing before I mask over this, so you'll see me do that in a step coming up. So we're just rendering the box. As I'm doing it, I'm sort of sketching it in, and then I go up closer to define my edges once I know that I'm happy with where that's sort of going. And then I want a bit of a sort of timber look, so I'm doing some of the shaded dagger strokes in there as well. Keep thinking to yourself, how would this look? You know, get yourself a reference if you need to, but think about it as a 3D object, not a flat object, and render it as such. I'm just working on the latches. So where they're joining the box. Again, they're pretty tiny, so you just need to suggest a few little details. A couple of little rivets there. You can see I've sort of moved a couple of them where they were originally dotted with the white. Like I said, you can re-sketch things in. The white's just there as your guide, almost like your sketch. So as you're tightening up your painting, you can tweak all those little details. So doing the other latch here. Last one. So we're getting through the artwork, which is good. Adding a bit more wood grain sort of detail. Shading underneath that top lip. Give it a bit more of a 3D appearance. Same thing on that part there. And then we're going to start rendering the designs that are on either side of the box. We want them to look like they're kind of carved into this old box. So we've got the two-headed freak show act on one side, complete with bow tie and top hat. Makes him even freakier. Alright, so we're just rendering that. You can see I'm shading back off my edge, but I'm just establishing the artwork, so that design first, and then I'll come in and I'll start really shading it. So I'm kind of outlining where that highlight is to make it look like it's sort of carved in and it's stepped in. Doing his legs. His arms. The other one. We'll do a similar sort of idea for the clown. Take your time, get your shading right. Now, even though we're at the top right with our highlight, the highlight is obviously going to pick up on the other edge because that's dipping down. So what happens is the light source picks up on that edge. So the shadows are kind of opposite whenever you're doing something that's carved into something. So keep that in mind. If you're unsure, either do an embossing sample on Photoshop or jump on Google, find yourself a reference and go from there. You can see I've just darkened that off to make it look like that lip is sitting up. kind of looking down on the angle, and because it's carved and that other bit's lower, it's casting that shadow. It's a bit hard to explain on a video, but you can see roughly the way it should be done. And obviously it'll be different depending on what kind of artwork you're doing. If you're unsure, it may pay to just start with a simple pattern or a simple design. So you can see the eye there of the clown, same idea. Start off with the outline and then run your shadows in there. And we're doing the winder, which is his nose. So just shaping that mechanism there, the winder mechanism, doing the hair of the clown. So just picking out the shape of it. So establishing that from our previous white that we did, that white sketch. As I go on, just rendering the other side with a bit more timber. So you'll notice I go a lot lighter and then I'll darken up areas, because you can always go darker, it's very hard to go lighter. So keep that in mind when you're airbrushing. That's pretty much true for any artwork that you're doing. I always suggest students to go light to dark. That way they got a bit more control as you getting the feel for your artwork. You can use that light color to paint your entire piece and then gradually darken it. If you try and go dark too quick and you're not confident with your airbrush, you can stuff up a section and then you'll have to go right back to the start to fix it. Whereas if you've gone too dark with a lighter tone, the next time you go with a darker tone, you just leave that bit out, and eventually by the time you finish all your tones, it'll disappear. So you sort of just put a drop shadow in off that winder, just picking out that bit of the mouth there. Sharpening up just on the ear a little bit. Bit of a shadow coming off to lift that hair. And then shading a bit into the hair as well, so it's not too flat. Even though these are just really a carving on the side of the box, you still want to make them look kind of three-dimensional. Now we're going to render that nose. So virtually the same sort of idea as what we did with the actual nose on the Jester. Again, I leave that little bit of a gap. Adding texture. And blending back over, and we're going to darken this area. And the box where the spring's disappearing into the base of the box. But jumping back to the hair first. Blending all that out. Adding a few more shades here and there. So just sped it up a little bit through here. Darkening off all this area so that it looks like the spring's disappearing into the void of the box, and just running that blend up from the base. You can also see a bit of the timber on the inside, so I haven't just gone totally solid. And now I've actually switched to white, and I'm going to come in and start highlighting some of these areas. So even though we've got another dark tone to do after this, the reason I do the white before the final dark tone is because I like to bring some highlights into it. And also, white, doesn't matter how good you are with an airbrush, it tends to always leave a fraction of overspray. So to eliminate that, and what it does is actually oversprays back onto your dark areas. So if you do it sort of as the second last tone, that helps because the final tone then will clean that up, that overspray, and then you can just focus on hitting some of the brighter white highlights at the end. But you'll see that as we move on. But at the moment, I'm just using that white just to bring out a lot of the areas, add a few more textures again, do the highlights within the metal sections, the springs and things like that. So remember, the white can also lift areas up, so you can bring them forward. Obviously bright highlights can make things look like metal, like I just mentioned earlier, so use them in certain areas, but we're really just going to start to shape this artwork with the white. So try not to dust over too much of your dark areas when you're using white, otherwise you're going to get a bit of a blue shift. So that's why we leave lighter areas and just shade in the darker spots, so that way wherever we put the light, the white, it's going to brighten up that section. So just working on that skull. So I'm not just hitting every single spot. I'm selective about where, like using it on the stitching, around the edges where the stitches are going into that fabric. So that'll give it a nice sort of 3D effect on the top of the jester's hat, on the skulls obviously for texturing, and to do underneath, where the cracks are and the sockets and things like that, and the nose sockets. So just be careful, don't overdo it. So I mean, you can see here it's pretty hard to see where I'm actually doing it. So it's zooming in is going to help a little bit, but you're not going to really notice it as much. You can see there on the glove, that just picks up that section. Doing some of the checkers, so just brightening that back up, and then we'll clean them up with the darker tone. Again, going a bit brighter on the glove, just to give it more that sort of material feel, so that it looks like a tight glove. Give it that almost latex sheen. And just adding textures. Obviously the highlight in the eye, a couple of little dot highlights like wet spots in the corner of the eye always looks good. Even though we did some highlighting on the nose with the eraser pencil, coming back in with the highlight of the white. So just mixing it up, not just using the eraser pencil, also using white. So you can do either or. Some people, they just use the eraser pencils to create their highlights. They won't use any white on their painting. So depending on what it is, for photorealism, that would be a better way to paint, not to use any white. But because this is a fantasy piece, I'm not too fussed. I don't mind using a bit of white to just bring out some of the highlights and co-combine it with the texturing that I've done. So just take your time to detail. Just working in that nose area. Doing the top of the gums there as well. So you can use, again, dot white highlights to really get the wet spots in the gums, which always looks pretty cool. I'm only hitting the center section of the gum, so the highest part where the tooth sits in. And some real tight, sharp highlights combined. It's almost like a little dot with a dagger stroke coming off it, to create the grooves in the lips. A little bit blurry up close, but you can at least see what I'm doing. Top of the teeth there. Pulling out some of those teeth with the highlight. So again, like a little flick down from the top part of the tooth, just flicking down with that white paint. And making the teeth a little bit uneven as well. Jumping back to the eye there, another little dot white highlight, and then brightening up the actual eyeball. Working on the top of the skin above the brow there. Creating more and more textures, so it's just layer upon layer upon layer. With the highlight, I'm just hitting certain areas just to make them look like crevices or lift certain areas up, so you can have like grooves in the skin. So you can see I'm moving around quite a bit, back on the hat for a little bit. So if I think things need to be a bit brighter, I'll go in and fix them up. Hitting that lower edge, it's the same as like a crack. You pick up on the lower edge of where your light source is. And highlighting some of that stretchy sort of material slash skin. I don't know what you want to call it, but highlighting a few more of the skulls. Brightening up the stitching on that one as well. And the top of that part of the hat. The brow on the skull, give it that mean look. Just the eye socket as well, and the center of that nose. Working some highlights on the ear. The other side of the strap there. Stitching. Brightening up the top of that part of the hat. And a brighter highlight on the top part again. Just that line there, or that sharper highlight on the skull. So again, moving around quite a bit, taking my time, and just wherever I see a section that I think needs a little bit more, I'll come back in and render that. Again, the center, the nostril, just that bone that runs up the center of most of the skull's noses. Teeth, which almost look like stitched in teeth. And then back on some highlights on the arm there and on the edge of that glove. Again, brightening up some of the areas of the glove, adding the detail back in. So I'm up nice and close when I'm doing this so that I'm not getting too much overspray. Hitting the top of the ruffles just to get them nice and bright. Picking up on the edges. Again, top of the ruffle, doing the dagger strokes. Same thing with your white too, don't just saturate it, so build it up. You'll notice that after doing numerous coats you'll get it nice and bright. And white does have the tendency to run a lot thicker than the other paints, because most of them run a titanium white, so that means it'll dry up a lot faster in your airbrush and tip dry more, and what'll happen is it'll kind of spit on you. It's like sort of crackly spit paint out, which is not nice, especially when you're doing fine detail. So I tend to reduce it down quite a bit, and then I'll just do numerous layers just to get the opacity. So don't just, I mean, I very, very rarely would I ever run it straight out of the bottle. So I tend to always reduce my paint. So coming back in now on the skin section, you can see nice and bright. A few more highlights on the ruffles. Not going right to that edge because I've got that drop shadow coming off the side of his face. Blending that out, and then you can see there exactly what I mean by layering it. Bit of tip drying, so pick that off and then back into it. Nice and sharp on the stretchy skin sections. Just getting the highlights in and running to the shape of the ruffles. Just being careful not to make them look flat. Building that highlight, building the white. Probably picking off tip drying again. And then coming back in, just working over the top of certain areas. So not just coating the whole area, leaving the gaps. So leaving sections that we've already darkened, just hitting the tops. And when I'm moving with it, paint on, paint off, so that trigger finger's going back and forth every time I'm moving. Again, tip drying. It is going to happen a lot. It's white. So don't be afraid. You should be doing it a lot, picking it off, spraying your airbrush out, and then back into it. You can almost see it on the video how quickly that needle goes white. So each individual part is probably boring everyone, but at least you get an idea. You can always fast forward sections, and now we're going a bit quicker. So just to finish the highlights on that jaw there. Again, creating some extra divots and uneven textures. So now we'll do some highlights on the actual spring. So reasonably bright with this. Well, actually nice and bright. You can see I'm just tapering that off. Bit hard to see off the video, but it is a nice sharp white highlight, and that'll give it that appearance that it's metal. Make sure that you run with the shape of it. I'm just hitting that one edge. Just the parts of the spring that would be exposed to the white highlights, to the light source I mean. So don't obviously go and highlight right around them. Same with what I'm doing on the box here, I'm just hitting the edges and then running a bit of that timber pattern through there as well. So just be careful, don't overkill it with white, like don't just hit everything and go crazy with the white. Even though you can come in and darken it off with our next tone, it's yeah, less is more. Just doing the nose of that handle there. We're going to add some bright highlights to the metal part of this, that handle crank. And we'll pick up those highlights again from the carving in of the artworks on either side, so the clown and the two-headed freak show man. You can see I'm just hitting highlights, so real fine dot white highlights as highlights for the rivets on the plates. Just highlighting the tops of them as well. So you just got to constantly think about, okay, how's the light going to affect this part? How's the light going to affect this? Treat everything as a separate piece. And if you're unsure, get yourself some references. A few highlights in the hair. Again, building that up. Bit of an uneven texture to make it look more like timber. Again, not to go too flat. A bit of a highlight and timber texture inside the box where it's going down into the dark void of the box. Just adds to the effect. Picking out some of the toes of the skeleton. So really, really close for these highlights. And for bone, you want the highlight to be reasonably bright. It'll give it more of the appearance of bone. Highlighting these legs. Just picking out some of the highlights off the glove. The trim of the glove. Give it that shine. The individual fingers. Again, running with my texture. So just using the highlights to bring out a bit more of that latex look to the glove. Finishing off some of the bone highlights on the skeleton. Going in, brightening up some of the areas of the ruffles. The rib cage. The teeth. Bits on the skull. Trying not to go over my shadow lines. Just adding a few more textures here and there. Same on the pins, the voodoo pins. So you can do a nice bright white highlight on those just to make them look like metal. So just brightening up a few areas here and there. So you can always just keep going over it and we'll keep brightening it. So which is good because you can do some areas and then move on to another spot and then come back if you think it needs to be brighter and just fix those up before you move on to your darker tone. I'm just going to highlight the two-headed man now. Doing his bow ties, hitting that edge as well. Doing the top hats. So nice and close for that highlight. Remember to follow the shape. Picking out the arm. Edge of the body, and then down to the leg. Other leg. And finally, the other arm. So you can see it's made him appear a lot more 3D and set back into the box. And now we're just going to highlight, add some sort of dagger stroke highlights and brighter fine highlights to simulate that timber texture running right through. You can see how that builds up that area. Even the little knots in the wood. Brightening up on the top of the box there as well. So I'm just constantly looking around, seeing what needs a bit more of a highlight, if I've missed anything. Even though I can come back later and do that, but that's technically what it should look like once you've done all this. So now I'm just, with a blue tack rag, I'm tack ragging that off. Because what I'm going to do is we're going to mask over the top of this in a minute. But first I want to spray a bit of SG100 Intercoat Clear by House of Colour. So you can see that's in my Revolution airbrush there, HPCR Revolution. And I'm just giving that a couple of light coats, letting that dry, and then I can mask over the top and not worry about anything lifting off. So it's just a good step to do this with any water-based paints. Takes a couple of minutes and allow it to dry, and you know, it's just a lot safer. I've got Hexus grey low-tack vinyl. This is what they call almost a spray mask. So I use this a lot for anything automotive. It gives you a nice clean edge, but it also doesn't have too much build, so it's not a very thick vinyl. You can also heat it up and it will curve a little bit, but the beauty of it is to automotive surfaces it sticks really well and cuts nice and easy. Plus you can see through it, and because it's low tack it leaves no glue or anything like that, so, and it's not very aggressive. So I just sort of let that drop over the whole artwork, and then with my applicator I just squeegee that out, and it makes it a little bit easier to see. Make sure that I get rid of most of the bubbles and try not to get creases in it. So you can see it's pretty easy to reposition as well. Squeegee that out. So that's all squeegeed down. I use my X-Acto blade with a fresh knife. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of this. We're not going to run through the whole lot filming me cutting the whole thing out, but virtually I've got to cut right around each line. So it took a little while to cut everything. I think it took about half an hour to cut the whole design out. So we're making a positive mask. So you're just going to see a little bit of cutting, and then we're going to go on to the next step of spraying in the background. So you can see I'm just twirling that. So now that I've cut everything, I want to remove the excess mask. So we only want a positive mask. Got to make sure you cut all your areas properly and carefully remove everything. Make sure you get all the inside sections. So take your time. Just going through, removing that mask. Lifting out the center sections. And there we have it. So now with some water-based degreaser, so this is a House of Colour one, but again, you can use any brand, will work. I'm just going to clean the panel again, just so that we get rid of any fingerprints or impressions from the masking film that could pick up when we spray lightly a background. So it's just a good idea to do this. Cleans up any sort of dried overspray or anything like that. And the beauty of it is you can kind of wipe it on and wipe it off, but if you do happen to miss anything, it's not like the solvent one where you really got to make sure you get it all off the panel. This one kind of evaporates out. So now I've got Jake here, he's going to do the background. So now that it's all masked up, he's spraying just a normal black around the masked up area of the Jester. So that's going to give us a nice clean edge now. We're going to get rid of any of that overspray that I was talking about. And we've still got another tone to go, but the reason I do this now instead of finishing the artwork and then doing it is because you're going to get a fraction of overspray from the next dark tone onto the artwork, and that'll give it more of a free-handy sort of, but more natural look, not too sticker looking, if that makes sense. Because when you remove the stencil after this step, you'll see it's quite sharp. So it'll still be extremely sharp, but it just allows for a bit more of a natural look. So he's actually going to airbrush some lightning and some dark gloomy clouds in the background. So once he's done this black, he'll move on to white, and he'll start to bring the white in to bring out his clouds, start adding the lightning bits and pieces, and then we'll be ready to jump onto the next step, which will be part 3 of this video series. So now with his airbrush and white in it, you can see he's just from a distance fogging in some highlighted areas just to start establishing his clouds. So this is the beauty, when it's all masked up, you don't have to worry about any overspray hitting any of the artwork. Again, he's building up his white, he's not just saturating it. And then he'll gradually highlight some of the areas and then run his lightning bolts. We might do a separate video on lightning, but you can see how he's doing his lightning bolts. They're not, I've seen them where they're too smooth, so you've got to have them jagged, but not too jagged. You've got to have sort of happy medium. He's hitting certain of areas of the join of the bolt and highlighting them out a little bit, so that way they look like they're glowing. So everyone does them differently. And where the bolt's coming out from the cloud, he's adding a bit of a highlight there too. So it's basically that highlight's created a glow in amongst that cloud. Again, if you're unsure, get yourself a reference. Jake's just making these ones up as he goes, but it's definitely a nice little way to finish the background and add a little bit of an effect. You don't want to go too crazy either with adding too many lightning bolts, because you can also ruin an artwork pretty quickly if you just go a bit too crazy with it. Then that goes for any sort of background. Remember, it is a background. You don't want it to take over the artwork. So he's just adding a few little highlights around the box there, almost like a bit of a picking up on the glow. Just working a bit more on fogging in those clouds. A couple more bolts here and there. So again, when you're doing something like this, if you're making it up, just less is more and gradually build on it. So a few little dot highlights there to brighten it up. And then now he's going to come back in and just add a bit more of a brighter texture to the cloud. Fog around where the tips are too, add a bit more glow there. So you can see he's moving around quite a bit. Bit of a highlight on one side of the Jester. Just to really pop it out. Looks like a bit of a mess at the moment, but once you remove that template and the Jester's back in focus, you'll see how effective that it really is. Now he's just coming in with a bit of black again, just to darken off some of the areas and deepen the shadows of the clouds to create more of a 3D element. That'll also blend them into the background so they look like they're emerging from the darkness. You can see he's heavier on one side, so he's just running with the light source. So pretty much done now with the lightning. Now I'm going to come in and remove that positive template, and you can see how much the artwork pops. So just carefully peel that off, and there you have it. The completed artwork up to this stage. So we've got a picture there, so make sure you tune in, check out part 3. Thanks for watching, and hit subscribe if you like our videos.